I'll never forget the way the ranger's eyes lingered on me that evening, like he was weighing something heavy in his mind, debating whether to speak or let me stumble into my own mistakes. His uniform was faded from years of sun and smoke, the kind of wear that couldn't be faked, and his voice carried a weight that didn't need raising. He wasn't warning me about bears or sudden storms. No, his warnings were about the places in Yellowstone that don't show up on official maps anymore. Trails that used to be open, places where RVs once parked without question. Places the park, for reasons it won't explain, has since forgotten. My name is Michael Rourke. I'm 43 years old, born and raised in Montana, though I spent most of my adult life behind the wheel of delivery trucks across the country. Last year, I finally gave in to an old dream, buying a beat-up RV and living close to the wild spaces that always called to me from the road's shoulder. Yellowstone, with all its raw beauty and living history, was the first place I wanted to camp. I'd visited as a boy, pressed against the backseat window while my father drove, but that was always the safe version. Crowded boardwalks, tour buses, and ranger talks about geysers. This time I wanted to go deeper. I wanted to hear the silence where the pavement ends. That's how I ended up parked near the old edge of Norris, where the ranger, his name tag said Harper, found me standing by my campfire. The evening was cool, with sulfur still drifting faintly on the breeze, the steam from distant vents rising like fingers pointing at the stars. He asked me how long I planned to stay. I told him 3 nights, maybe 4. He asked me where I planned to drive, and I shrugged. I said I liked the idea of wandering, letting the road decide. That was when he looked at me in that way, like a man who had seen enough wandering souls end badly. "You see those roads back there?" he asked, gesturing beyond the tree line where the gravel broke into something darker, narrower. Used to be RV trails. Families camped there all the time back in the 50s, 60s, before the park shut them down. "Shut them down, why?" I asked. Harper hesitated, rubbing the brim of his hat. "Different reasons. Said the land was unstable. Said it was for the safety of the public. But those trails don't disappear, son. They just grow over. You drive far enough, you'll still find clearings where people parked. You'll still see old fire rings. You might even see the remains of campers that didn't make it out." His words sat heavy in the air, but I brushed them off with a half smile. "So, you're telling me I shouldn't go exploring?" He looked right at me then, sharp and unwavering. "I'm telling you, if you do, don't ignore what you hear at night. And for God's sake, if you see lights moving between the trees, don't assume it's people." That night, lying on the thin mattress in my RV, I kept turning his words over in my mind. Yellowstone has always been dangerous. Bears, boiling springs, unpredictable weather. But something in his voice told me this wasn't about the obvious dangers. This was about something else. Something you don't put on brochures. I fell asleep to the sound of wind threading through the lodge poles, and though I tried to convince myself otherwise, I dreamed of headlights weaving silently through black trees. The next morning, I gave in to curiosity. Maybe it was arrogance. Maybe it was just the old habit of ignoring warnings until they proved themselves true. I packed up a small bag, filled the tank, and turned down one of those narrow gravel stretches Harper had pointed out. My RV rattled as the road grew rougher, the pines leaning in close on both sides like they were watching. After a few miles, the trail widened, and sure enough, I found what looked like an abandoned clearing. The grass was bent in odd ways, as though vehicles had once sat here long enough to leave permanent imprints. A stone ring of a fire pit sat crumbled in the middle, blackened, but long cold. The place felt like memory made solid, a pause in the forest where something once happened and refused to leave entirely. I told myself I'd just spend the day here, maybe one night, then head back to the main loop. I parked, leveled the RV as best I could, and set out a chair. The silence felt thicker than other campsites, almost as if the birds didn't want to cross into this space. Every sound seemed to come from farther away, distant woodpeckers, faint trickles of water, But within the clearing itself, it was as though sound stopped. I should have listened to that silence. I should have turned back then. Instead, I walked the edge of the site, scanning the tree line. That was when I saw the first sign, a rusted metal cooler, half buried in dirt, its lid snapped off. Inside were remnants of cans, their labels gone, their bodies punctured with holes. Animals, maybe. Or maybe not. Beside it lay the twisted frame of what looked like an old lantern. I kicked at the ground and uncovered a tire track fossilized in mud, the grooves deeper than they should have been, as if the vehicle had sunk halfway before forcing its way out. It all looked decades old, but it was impossible to shake the feeling that someone had left in a hurry. That night I sat by my small fire, the smoke curling upward, swallowed by the blackness above. Yellowstone's skies are like nothing else, so many stars it feels like falling into them. But from that clearing they seemed smothered, muted somehow. The flames gave little warmth. I ate my meal, checked the perimeter with my flashlight, and returned to the RV when the wind picked up. By midnight, I was lying awake, listening. It started as a faint knocking. Not on my RV, not close. More like two pieces of wood tapping together out among the trees. A steady rhythm, 3 beats, then silence, then 3 again. My heart jumped, but I told myself it was branches swaying in the wind. I told myself it was natural. But then after a long pause, the knocking repeated. Only this time it came from the opposite side of the clearing. Same rhythm. Same 3 beats, as if something had moved. I sat up, every nerve alive. My instinct was to grab the flashlight, step outside, prove it was nothing. But I remembered Harper's words, "Don't ignore what you hear. Don't assume it's people." So I stayed inside. I lay back down, staring at the ceiling, listening as the sound came and went, circling. At some point, I must have drifted into uneasy sleep because I woke with the dawn, stiff and bleary-eyed, the forest quiet again. When I stepped out, the fire pit I had built the night before was scattered. Ashes spread like gray hands across the dirt. My chair was knocked over, lying 10 feet from where I'd left it. And across the clearing, pressed deep into the soft ground, were footprints. Not boots, not shoes. Bare, human, and far too long. I stood there trembling, my breath white in the morning air, staring at those prints. I thought of Harper's warning. I thought of the way he had hesitated before speaking. He hadn't told me everything. He couldn't. And yet, standing there in the cold light of day, I wasn't ready to leave. Not yet. Because fear has a way of hooking you, twisting into curiosity, and curiosity out here is the most dangerous trail of all. I tried to convince myself it was a trick of moisture, shadows, erosion, that the footprints weren't what they appeared to be. The ground here was soft, spongy with last night's dew, and anything could distort impressions. That's what I told myself as I bent closer, tracing the edges with my fingers. But the shape was too clear, the length too deliberate. I measured one against my boot, and the heel stretched nearly half again as long. Whoever or whatever had left those prints hadn't just walked past. They had circled my camp in the night, close enough to watch the fire die out, close enough to touch. I packed quickly that morning. Coffee boiled, but I barely drank it, my nerves already buzzing. The silence of the clearing pressed against me harder than before, as if even the insects had withdrawn. When I finally climbed behind the wheel of the RV and turned the ignition, I expected relief. But the engine's rumble felt out of place, too loud, an intruder in that heavy hush. I backed out onto the trail and drove slowly, gravel crunching beneath the tires, eyes fixed on the trees. Every so often I thought I glimpsed movement, a pale flicker between the trunks, too tall to be deer. The trail wound deeper instead of shallower. I swore I had driven the same direction I'd come in, but the miles ticked by and the woods only thickened. Lodge poles rose like spires, straight and endless, their bark darkened with pitch. The road narrowed, until branches scraped along the RV's sides with fingernail shrieks. A sense of wrongness crept in, a crawling under the skin, the way you feel when you realize you've taken a wrong turn in a neighborhood where the houses no longer have curtains in the windows. Finally, I broke through into another clearing, larger this time, ringed by stumps where trees had been cut. In the middle stood the husk of an RV, its white paint peeled to gray, windows shattered. The door hung open, rocking faintly in the breeze. My stomach clenched. The thing looked ancient, abandoned decades ago, yet its tires hadn't fully rotted. There was still metal glint on the rims, as though whoever owned it had only recently stopped caring. I told myself to keep driving. But some force drew me out, the same reckless pull that had made me ignore Ranger Harper's warning in the first place. The air was different here, thicker, sourer, as though something had burned long ago and left its ghost behind. I stepped cautiously, boots crunching over glass until I reached the broken RV. Inside, the stench hit me first. Mildew, rust, and something sweet beneath it, like fruit left too long in the sun. The furniture was torn, cushions scattered. A child's toy truck lay on its side in the corner, its wheels chewed away by time. The refrigerator door hung open, black mold feathering inside. On the table, though, there were papers, maps, curled and yellowed, showing trails that didn't match the ones on official park brochures. Hand-drawn notes scrawled in the margins, "Don't stay past dusk. Listen for the knocks. Don't follow the lights." My blood ran cold. These were the same warnings Harper had given me, almost word for word. I shoved the papers into my bag without thinking. A sudden creak came from the far end of the abandoned RV, like weight shifting. I froze, heart hammering. The air pressed thick in my ears. Slowly, I turned my flashlight toward the sound. The beam cut across broken bunks, peeling wallpaper, and then stopped on a smear across the wall. A handprint, dark and sunken into the wood, too fresh to be decades old. I bolted out of there, stumbling into daylight, breath ragged. My RV looked absurdly small and fragile, parked beside that ruin, but it was the only shelter I had. I slammed the door behind me and gripped the wheel until my knuckles whitened. My instincts screamed to turn around, floor it, get back to the main road. But when I checked the trail behind me, it was gone, swallowed by trees that seemed to have grown closer while I wasn't looking. So I drove forward. Hours passed. The sun climbed, then dipped, yet the trail never led me back to anything familiar. The GPS on my phone flickered uselessly, bouncing between blank screens. I passed no signs, no markers, no other vehicles. Just endless forest, endless gravel, endless sense of being pulled deeper into something that didn't want to let me go. By dusk, I was running on fumes, both gas and nerves. I pulled into another shallow clearing and shut the engine off, too exhausted to fight the road any longer. The forest swallowed the last of the light, shadows knitting themselves together like closing curtains. I lit a small fire, though it smoked more than it burned, and sat beside it with my back to the RV, trying to stay awake. But fatigue is its own predator. At some point, my eyelids sagged. I woke to the sound of tapping again. 3 knocks. Pause. 3 more. This time closer, right at the edge of the firelight. I grabbed the flashlight and snapped it on. The beam cut through smoke and branches, and for a split second, I thought I saw them. Figures between the trees. Too tall, their arms hanging too low, their faces pale as bark. The light bounced, and they vanished, leaving only the sway of branches. My pulse thundered. The fire sputtered lower, its coals winking like dying eyes. Then came the smell. At first faint like damp earth, but it thickened quickly, sour and metallic, seeping into my lungs. I gagged, covering my nose, but the stench clung, like meat left in a cooler long after the ice had melted. It seemed to ooze from the trees themselves, as if something hidden in their roots was rotting but still moving. I stumbled back into the RV, slammed the door, locked it. The smell pressed against the walls, sinking into the fabric. The knocking resumed, this time on the RV itself. 3 beats on the side panel, so close it rattled the frame. Then again, on the opposite side. Then again, at the rear, circling me faster as if several hands or claws were drumming in rhythm. I shouted, voice breaking, but the sound seemed to vanish into the air. No echo, no response. Just the steady, maddening knocks. Desperation drove me to grab the maps from my bag, those fragile papers taken from the abandoned camper. I spread them across the small table, hands shaking, trying to trace the trails. My eyes caught on a note scribbled across the bottom of one. They don't let you leave the same way you came. Don't follow the road twice. The knocks stopped. Silence fell so suddenly it rang in my ears. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat rigid in the driver's seat, eyes on the windshield, waiting for dawn. When the first gray light bled into the clearing, I turned the key. Miraculously, the engine roared. I drove without direction, steering wherever the road twisted, refusing to backtrack. Hours later, I spilled out onto asphalt, blinking against the sight of a paved park road. Relief hit me so hard I almost wept, but the relief didn't last, because as I pulled onto the main loop, gasping at the sight of other campers and cars, I glanced at the passenger seat. The maps I'd taken lay scattered there, and across the top sheet, scrawled in fresh ink I hadn't seen before, were 5 words: "We warned you last night." I pulled over at the first turnout I found, hands shaking so badly I nearly clipped the guardrail. My breath came ragged, like I'd sprinted miles though I hadn't moved from behind the wheel. The maps lay spread across the passenger seat, the scrawled words staring back at me. I had to touch them to prove to myself it wasn't just a trick of sleepless eyes. The ink was real, black and wet enough that it smudged beneath my thumb. No one had been inside my RV. I hadn't stopped once since I left that clearing, and yet someone or something had written to me. I wanted to tear the maps up, throw them into the roadside ditch, and drive until the park was nothing but a memory in my mirrors. But my gut clenched with the knowledge that whatever was happening wouldn't vanish with torn paper. It wasn't the maps following me. It was the trails themselves. That was when I saw the Ranger again. A beat-up Ford truck rolled to a stop behind me, and out stepped Harper, that same weary look on his face. For a moment, relief surged through me, like maybe he'd explain it all away. Maybe this was just some elaborate prank or a story told too well. But as he walked closer, I saw it, the tightness in his jaw, the way his hand hovered near his radio but never touched it. "You went out there, didn't you?" he asked, voice low, not accusing, just resigned. I opened my mouth, but the words stuck. Finally, I nodded. He exhaled through his nose, heavy as stone. "I told you not to." I couldn't help it, I stammered. "I thought it was just abandoned roads. I didn't know." My voice trailed off because what could I say? That the forest itself was circling me? That something had written warnings inside my own rig? Harper leaned against the hood of my RV, looking out toward the tree line as though listening for something. "They don't like being remembered," he said finally. "Those trails, those old camps, they're not just closed, they're buried. Some things the park can't admit to, not in public, so they let them fade, but nothing in Yellowstone ever really fades." I told him about the abandoned RV, about the handprint, about the knocking that had circled me like a predator. Harper's face didn't change, but his eyes sharpened, scanning mine, gauging how deep I'd already gone. "You saw them," he said flatly. Not a question. I swallowed hard. "What are they?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small tin of chewing tobacco, turning it in his hand as if the motion steadied him. "Back in the 60s, he said, before they shut those roads down, families went missing, not 1 or 2, dozens. They chalked it up to bears, to weather, to people getting lost, but the truth was stranger. People would set up camp and then they'd hear knocking, see lights moving where no lantern should be. The lucky ones ran before it got worse. The others, they stayed. And the next morning, their rigs were empty. Food still on the tables. Coffee half drunk." My skin prickled. "And the unlucky ones?" Harper's gaze locked on mine. "Some of them we found, but they weren't themselves anymore. Eyes vacant, voices gone, like the land had hollowed them out. After a while, the Park Service stopped looking too hard. Easier to close the roads, tell the public it was for safety. Easier to let the forest swallow the evidence." I shook my head, bile rising in my throat. Then why warn me at all? Why not keep it secret?" His jaw worked. "Because once you've seen them, they don't stop. They mark you. Best I can do is tell you how to keep ahead." The world tilted around me like gravity had shifted. You're saying I'm stuck with this, that I can't just leave. You can leave the park, Harper said, his tone grim. But they'll know you, and they'll follow. Sometimes it's worse outside the boundaries because nobody knows to listen for knocks out there. I felt sick, like the ground had given way under my boots. My whole life I'd thought of Yellowstone as a sanctuary, a place untouched and wild. Now it felt like a trap disguised as beauty. Harper reached into his pocket and handed me a folded piece of paper. His handwriting scrawled across it in block letters. Don't follow the same road twice. Don't chase the lights. If you hear 3 knocks, wait before moving. If you hear 4, run. Never camp alone twice in the same place. I stared at the list, the words swimming. What happens if I break the rules? He looked away, jaw tightening. You already know. A cold wind swept down the road, rattling the pines. Harper adjusted his hat, then stepped back toward his truck. I've said more than I should. You ought to leave while you still can. Wait, I called, panic rising in my chest. What about the maps? Something wrote on them. That stopped him. He turned, eyes narrowing. Then they've already taken an interest in you. And without another word, he climbed back into his truck and drove off, gravel spitting beneath his tires. I stood there shaking, the paper crumpled in my fist, the maps staring at me from the passenger seat like open mouths. For hours, I sat in the RV, too paralyzed to move. Tourists drove past on the paved road behind me, laughing, pointing at bison grazing in the meadows. To them, Yellowstone was a postcard come alive. To me, it had become a labyrinth of unseen rules, and one misstep would mean disappearing like those families Harper spoke of. But the strangest part was this. As much as terror gnawed at me, some darker pull remained, a need to understand, a need to see what had been hidden. That night, against every sane thought, I parked at a different turnout, deep off the main loop. I lit no fire. I kept the curtains drawn, and still in the small hours I heard it, 3 knocks against the side of the RV, soft, patient, waiting. And I understood then, this was no accident. The forgotten trails had found me. The knocking didn't stop until dawn, 3 beats every half hour, never hurried, never frantic, like a clock in the hands of something that wasn't human, counting down to an hour it had already chosen. I sat rigid in the driver's seat, shotgun across my lap, though I doubted it would do any good, and waited for morning. When the first pale light filtered through the lodge poles, I didn't waste time. I fired up the RV and drove, ignoring the ache in my eyes from a night without sleep, ignoring the way the air seemed thicker, heavier, like the forest itself didn't want me to leave. I told myself I was done with Yellowstone. Done with wandering trails that shouldn't exist. Done with forgotten warnings scribbled on paper and whispered through ranger teeth. I wanted asphalt beneath me, the open highway, truck stops, and gas stations, and the anonymous comfort of neon lights. Civilization might not erase what had happened, but at least it would put distance between me and the shadows pressing against those trees. For a while, it worked. The road widened, signs appeared. I passed families with campers, kids hanging their heads out the windows, pointing at elk in the distance. They laughed, they shouted, they breathed free. I almost envied them. They didn't know the rules Harper had written. They didn't know the knocks in the night. They still thought the park was only geysers and rivers and predictable dangers. By noon, I was outside the northern entrance, rolling through Gardner with its gas pumps and diners and gift shops peddling bison keychains. The world felt normal again. I filled the tank, drank coffee that scalded my tongue, and for the first time in 2 days, I let my shoulders drop. I told myself it was over, but when I returned to the RV, I saw the maps on the seat. I hadn't touched them since that morning, yet the top sheet had changed again. The black scrawl, impossible and fresh, stretched across the corner. You can drive, but the road belongs to us. The cup of coffee slipped from my hand and shattered on the pavement. Tourists turned to look, but I ignored them, my throat dry as ash. I climbed in, slammed the door, and peeled out of the lot like a fugitive. I told myself I'd burn the maps, shred them, anything to sever their grip. But every mile I drove, they shifted. Pages I swore had been blank now bore marks. Lines, symbols, circles that looked less like cartography and more like traps. That night I parked at a rest stop 2 hours north, telling myself it was far enough. The air smelled of sage and asphalt, the hum of the highway filling the background like a protective blanket. I thought I could finally sleep, but around 3 in the morning I woke to a sound I'd been praying I'd never hear again. Knock, knock, knock. 3 beats against the side of the RV. I shot upright, chest hollowing with dread. This wasn't Yellowstone anymore. This was Montana highway country. And still, they had found me. I forced myself to peer through the blinds. The parking lot was empty, except for a semi idling near the entrance. But between the glare of its headlights and the shadows beyond, I thought I saw them. Figures again, 2 tall, arms hanging low, standing perfectly still. Watching. I shut the blinds, heart slamming, and pressed my back against the wall. For an hour the knocking continued, moving around the RV the way it had in the clearing. Patient. Relentless. And when it finally stopped, silence roared louder than any highway. The next morning I drove without pause. Through Montana, into Wyoming, across state lines until the miles blurred. I thought distance might thin whatever thread connected me to those trails. But at every stop, every gas station, the evidence followed. In one bathroom mirror, condensation spelled faint letters that vanished when I wiped. 4 knocks, and you're ours. In another town, I bought a sandwich, and when I unwrapped the paper in my RV, there were faint marks beneath the grease stains, circles like those on the maps. By the 3rd day, exhaustion warped into paranoia. I jumped at every sound. I refused to camp in the same spot twice. Harper's rules etched themselves into my brain, each line heavier than the last. But one rule gnawed more than the others. Don't follow the road twice. It made no sense at first. Roads are meant to be retraced. Highways go both ways. But when I reached a stretch of empty interstate, something compelled me to test it. I pulled over at a lonely exit, waited 10 minutes, then turned back onto the same stretch I'd just driven. The moment I passed the same mile marker, the air changed. The world seemed tilted. The sky dimmed unnaturally, clouds bleeding across the sun. And in the mirrors, I saw them. Dozens of pale shapes standing at the tree line that lined the interstate, all facing my RV. Still. Waiting. Panic seized me. I slammed the accelerator, heart hammering, refusing to look back again. When I finally exited, taking a random turn into a town I didn't recognize, the light returned. The shapes were gone. But I understood now. Harper hadn't lied. Roads weren't neutral anymore. They belonged to whatever had marked me. That night, I parked in a Walmart lot, surrounded by other RVs, semis, travelers. The chatter of voices and the buzz of streetlights gave me courage. I almost convinced myself safety lay in numbers. I almost drifted into real sleep. Until the 4th knock came. It wasn't loud, just a soft, deliberate rap on the door. 4 beats, not 3. The sound turned my veins to ice. My body moved before my mind could process, shoving furniture against the door, grabbing every weapon I owned. My breath came ragged, ears straining. 4 knocks meant run. But where could I run? The lot was full of people. I couldn't fling open the door without dragging them into this. So I sat, trembling, as silence pressed in after the 4th knock. Minutes passed, then hours, and finally, morning light. The others in the lot stirred, starting engines, sipping coffee. To them, it had been an ordinary night. To me, it was a reprieve, borrowed time I didn't deserve. By now, I knew the truth. This wasn't just about Yellowstone. The forgotten trails weren't bound by the park's borders. Once you walked them, once you heard the knocks, you carried them with you. No matter where I drove, no matter how far, the rules applied. And if I broke them, if I ignored them even once more, I wouldn't be the one telling this story. I drove for weeks after that Walmart night, clinging to the rules Harper had pressed into my hand like scripture. Never the same campsite twice. Never retrace a road. Listen for 3 knocks, run from 4. It turned my life into a ritual of exhaustion, perpetual motion, constant vigilance. The kind of living that isn't really living at all. I thought maybe time would dull their interest, that if I kept moving, if I kept obeying, maybe the knocking would fade into memory. But the truth was crueler. The longer I obeyed, the more aware I became of them. I'd glance in mirrors and see shapes that shouldn't be there. I'd hear laughter on the wind that sounded almost human until it bent into something broken. Even in the middle of crowded cities, with engines roaring and lights blaring, I'd feel it, that silent attention pressing against me like a hand on the back of my neck. It wasn't living, it was hiding. And that was when the thought began to fester. If I wanted it to end, if I wanted my life back, I couldn't just keep running. I would have to go back to Yellowstone, back to the forgotten trails, back to where it began. The idea sickened me, but it also grew roots. Each day, it gnawed deeper, until the fear of staying this way outweighed the fear of facing what waited in those woods. I remembered Harper's face, his weary resignation. He hadn't said escape was possible. He'd only said the best I could do was keep ahead. But what if there was another way? What if the only way out was through? So one cold morning, after a night of restless half-sleep in a truck stop, I turned the wheel south and headed back toward the park. The closer I got, the heavier the air grew. By the time I passed into Wyoming, a storm was building, clouds stacked black on black across the horizon. The radio crackled with static. My GPS died completely, even on the main roads. It was as if the land already knew where I was going, and it was preparing for my arrival. At the northern gate, I half expected to see Harper waiting, but the station was empty, the window blinds drawn. I drove on, deeper into the park, following instinct rather than signs. The tourists and families thinned until there was no one left. No cars, no voices, just me, my RV, and the winding roads that led to silence. I reached the turnout where I'd first met Harper. The place looked the same, but wrong somehow. The trees leaned closer, the shadows thicker. The storm above had split, leaving a bruised sky that seemed to watch. I parked, turned off the engine, and sat in the stillness. My heartbeat thudded so loud it seemed to echo. Then I heard it. Knock, knock, knock. 3 beats, clear against the side of the RV. Not hesitant, not probing, a summons. I opened the door. The clearing stretched before me, empty at first glance, but as I stepped into the open air, the shapes emerged. Dozens of them, tall, pale, arms hanging too low, faces carved of bark and bone. They ringed the space, silent, patient, their heads all turning toward me in unison. My chest tightened, but I forced myself to stand firm. I came back, I said, voice shaking. I'm not running anymore. The silence deepened like the forest was drawing breath. Then one figure stepped forward, taller than the rest, its face hollowed where eyes should be. It raised its hand and knocked once on the air. The sound reverberated, not wood, not metal, but something older, a sound that belonged to the earth itself. The maps in my RV rustled. I didn't need to see them to know they were changing again. Lines rewriting themselves, new marks appearing. A story still being written. I understood then. The trails weren't abandoned. They weren't forgotten. They were alive. The park had buried them, yes, but the forest had kept them, waiting for those foolish enough to step off the paved roads. And now I was theirs. But not in the way I had feared. Not as prey. Not as another hollowed husk left in an empty camper. They had marked me as something else. A voice. A messenger. The tall figure lowered its hand, and in the silence that followed, a truth settled into my bones. The rules weren't just warnings. They were commandments, tests. And by surviving them, by obeying, I had become something like them. Not entirely human anymore, but not yet consumed either. Balanced on a knife edge, carrying their whispers wherever I went. The others shifted, a ripple through the clearing. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, they melted back into the trees, leaving me alone beneath the storm. I staggered back to the RV, body trembling, and collapsed into the driver's seat. The maps lay open across the dash. My eyes fell on the top page where fresh ink stretched across the paper. Your road now. I don't remember leaving the park. I don't remember driving north again. I only remember waking hours later in some nameless town, the storm gone, the world normal. Normal, except for the maps that kept writing themselves, drawing roads I had never seen. And I know this much. I can't stop now. I can't settle. I can't return to a life of comfort and ignorance, because the forgotten trails aren't confined to Yellowstone. They're everywhere, hidden beneath the pavement, beneath the dirt, beneath the stories we tell ourselves about safety and wilderness. The knocking follows me still, sometimes 3 beats, sometimes 4. But I don't run anymore. I listen, I obey, and I drive, because the road belongs to them. And now, so do I. I never used to be afraid of silence. I used to welcome it. The hum of my old Volkswagen van parked beneath the trees, the hiss of a lantern as I clicked it off, like the gentle crackle of wood settling in the fire pit. These were the sounds that used to cradle me when I camped. Silence felt like freedom. But on Mount Rainier, that silence turned into something else, something I can't forget. I can't tell this story without admitting that I was wrong about the mountains. I thought they were safe if you respected them, if you stayed on the right paths, if you followed the rules. What I learned out there is that sometimes respect isn't enough. Sometimes the mountain takes what it wants. It was late summer, early September. The mornings still carried a cold bite, but the afternoons could warm you until you forgot that winter wasn't far away. I'd been driving through Washington for weeks, hopping from one campground to another, writing little journal entries about the people I met, the meals I cooked on my camp stove, the small challenges of life in a van. My Volkswagen wasn't new, far from it. The thing rattled on steep inclines, and I had to feather the clutch like a stubborn animal, but it was mine, and I loved it. On this particular stretch, I had agreed to meet up with 2 friends, Megan and Josh, who had driven in from Oregon. They had a small dome tent and a dog named Scout. We planned to spend a long weekend together near Mount Rainier, where the air smelled of wet pine and the stars burned like frost at night. The first night was uneventful. We found a small campsite tucked along a dirt road just outside the main park boundary. From where we parked, you could see the white crown of Rainier in the distance, glowing faintly in the moonlight. The campground was quiet, just a few other campers scattered among the trees. We cooked sausages over the fire, drank cheap beer, and talked about the summer slipping away. The only strange thing, and we laughed about it at the time, was the silence of the woods. No crickets, no owls, no distant scurry of raccoons. Just the sharp crackle of our fire and the occasional sigh of wind high in the branches. The morning after, we noticed something odd. The site next to us, empty when we arrived, then occupied by a young couple who pulled in late, just as we were finishing our beers, was bare. Completely bare. Their tent, their car, their cooler, gone. The only thing left was a blackened patch of ground where their fire had been, scorched far darker than seemed normal. We joked that they must have packed up early, but Megan frowned. "I didn't hear a car start," she said. I shrugged it off. I figured I was too deep asleep to notice. By afternoon, I had convinced myself it was nothing. Campers move on, especially the casual kind. But that evening, when we wandered to another clearing to watch the mountain turn orange in the last light, we noticed another site on the far side of the loop had vanished too. Same story, tent gone, vehicle gone, belongings gone, but a blackened circle of ground where the fire had been. Almost like it had burned longer than it should, hotter than wood alone could explain. Josh crouched down, dragging a stick through the ash. "Looks like someone dumped kerosene or something," he muttered. But there was no smell of fuel, only the acrid sting of cold charcoal and dirt. We stood there longer than we should have, staring at nothing, until Scout growled low in his throat and tugged at the leash. Megan pulled him back, and I remember her eyes in the twilight wide and unsettled. "Let's just get back," she said. That night our fire felt different. Every crack sounded too sharp, too loud, as if the trees themselves were listening. We burned through more wood than usual, just to keep the flames strong, as though brightness alone could push back whatever was pressing at us in the dark. Around midnight, When we finally doused the fire and zipped ourselves into the van and tent, I had the uneasy sense that the campground was emptier than before, like the silence had swallowed more than just sound. I woke to noise. At first, I thought it was just Scout shifting outside the van, but the sound repeated, soft, irregular knocks like someone rapping on the woodpile. I sat up, heart pounding, listening. The van windows were fogged with cold. I wiped a circle clear with my sleeve and peered out, but the night was too dark. The fire pit glowed faintly with embers, and beyond that, only shapes of trees and shadows that seemed to move when I blinked. The knocks came again, 3 in a row, then silence. Then 2 more, louder, closer. I held my breath, waiting for a flashlight beam, a crunch of boots, some sign of a late-night hiker wandering in. Nothing. Just those hollow knocks fading into the kind of quiet that presses against your ears. When morning came, I stepped out of the van with a dry throat. My woodpile was gone, not scattered, not knocked over, gone. Every log, every branch stripped clean. The dirt where it had sat was bare, almost polished, as though something had lifted the whole pile in the night. Megan emerged from the tent looking pale, Scout whining at her side. She didn't even need to say it. Their pile was gone, too. We walked the loop in silence, checking other sites. Same story. The campers at the far end who had arrived in a pickup 2 nights before were gone without a trace, and their fire pit was ringed with black scorch marks. The only site left with belongings was ours. Us, standing there under the tall trees, clutching empty mugs and pretending not to notice how cold the air felt against our skin. That day, everything shifted. We tried to go about our routines, boiling coffee, making oatmeal, planning a short hike, but it was all hollow. Every conversation circled back to the same question. Had we actually heard cars leaving, doors slamming, engines starting? None of us could remember. And the longer we sat with that realization, the heavier it felt. By late afternoon, Josh suggested we pack up. "It's not worth it," he said. "Too many weirdos out here." But Megan resisted. She wasn't ready to run. She wanted to understand, to look for answers before we bolted. I found myself torn between them. My instincts screamed to leave, but some stubborn, dangerous part of me agreed with her. Maybe if we just stayed one more night, we'd see what was happening. Maybe then it would make sense. As the sun sank and the shadows lengthened, I gathered more wood than I'd ever burned before. I piled it high, higher than felt safe, and lit it early, the flames catching fast and leaping tall. The fire painted our faces orange, carved the trees into silhouettes, and for a few hours we sat there pretending it was normal, pretending laughter could drown out the way the woods seemed to close in around us. But when the laughter died, the mountain spoke again. Not with words, but with silence, deeper than any silence I've ever known. It pressed against my skull, throbbed in my chest, made me feel like even my breath was too loud. And then, just after midnight, the knocking returned. The knocking was different this time, more deliberate, as if someone or something was taking its time. It started soft, like fingertips on bark, then grew heavier, echoing through the stillness. I sat frozen in the van, my breath fogging the glass. Scout whimpered low in the tent outside, and I heard Megan hiss his name, trying to quiet him. Josh stirred next to her, unzipping the tent flap with an impatient rasp. "Who's out there?" he called, his voice cutting into the night like a blade. The knocking stopped instantly. For a moment, I thought maybe that was it. Maybe whoever was messing with us had realized we weren't easy marks. But then the forest answered back in a way that made my stomach lurch. Not with a voice, not with footsteps, but with a sound I can't put neatly into words. A long exhale, heavy and damp, like air being forced from lungs too large to belong to anything human. It rolled through the trees, stirred the ashes in our fire pit, and left a taste in my mouth like copper. Josh cursed, fumbling for the flashlight. The beam shot out, slicing across the trunks and undergrowth, but there was nothing. Nothing but trees stacked on trees, shadows layered like curtains. The beam swung left, right, up, and that's when I saw it. Not clearly, not enough to make sense of it, but just a suggestion of movement at the far edge of the light. Something tall, shifting back behind a tree. Too fast, too deliberate. My chest tightened. I wanted to scream at Josh to turn off the light, to get back inside, to stop drawing attention, but the words stuck in my throat. The forest went quiet again, so quiet that I could hear my own pulse hammering. Then, faint but certain, came the crunch of something dragging along the dirt, slow, rhythmic, scraping across the ground where our woodpile had once been. I didn't realize until later that my hands were trembling so hard I'd left sweat prints on the glass. We didn't sleep the rest of that night. Josh sat outside the tent with the flashlight on his lap, Megan curled next to Scout, whispering to keep him calm. I stayed inside the van with the engine keys clutched in my fist, ready to go at the first sign of real danger. But no one, nothing, came closer. The scraping faded. The silence returned. Dawn eventually crept through the trees like a reluctant guest. When we finally stepped out, our firewood was gone again. Not just what we'd piled, but the half-burned logs in the pit, as though the embers themselves had been scooped away. What was left was darker than before, scorched deeper, the soil brittle and cracked. Megan knelt by it, running her fingers over the ground, and I swear I saw her shiver. We decided to move campsites. None of us said it outright, but we were all thinking the same thing. Maybe it wasn't safe to stay in one place. We drove further up the mountain, deeper into the park, to a spot near a small creek. There were fewer people there, just a pair of backpackers we saw once at the water, then no one else. I told myself that was good, that less company meant less chance of running into whatever weirdos might have been playing tricks before. But the emptiness only added weight to the air. That night, the knocking didn't come. Instead, it was the smell that woke me. At first, I thought maybe Josh had stoked the fire again, but when I opened my eyes, the van was dark. The smell was sharp and chemical, like burned plastic mixed with something sour. I sat up, gagging, and pressed my sleeve to my nose. Outside, Scout was whining, pawing at the dirt. Megan hissed for him to settle, but her voice was tight with fear. When I opened the van door, the smell hit harder, thick and acrid. The fire pit was empty. We hadn't lit it that night, but the ground around it was smoldering, faint wisps of smoke curling up as though something beneath the soil was burning. Josh stumbled out with a bottle of water, pouring it onto the dirt, but the steam only rose higher, carrying that foul stench into the night. We backed away, coughing, covering our mouths. And then just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The smoke thinned. The smell lifted. The ground cooled. Josh muttered a shaky laugh, insisting it was some kind of underground root fire. A freak accident. Megan didn't look convinced. Neither was I. By morning, the scorch marks were there again. Blacker, wider, spreading beyond the pit as though creeping toward where we'd parked. I walked the perimeter, tracing the char with my boots, and I realized something that turned my stomach cold. Every mark, every circle of burned ground we'd seen at the other campsites had looked exactly like this. It wasn't just firewood disappearing. It was something feeding, leaving behind these scars. That day we barely spoke. We hiked a little, but the woods felt wrong. The air was too still, the shadows too thick. Even the creek water tasted metallic, like it had carried ash downstream. We ate quietly, Scout refusing food, his ears pinned back and eyes darting at sounds only he seemed to hear. When darkness fell again, we didn't bother with a fire. We sat inside the van and tent, lanterns dimmed, trying to pretend the silence was just silence. But around midnight, the knocking returned. Louder this time, heavier, reverberating like it was inside the trees themselves. 3 knocks, then 5, then a pause that stretched until I wanted to scream. And then a sound worse than any knocking, the unmistakable crack of wood being split, torn apart, carried away piece by piece. I clutched the keys in my fist again, my knuckles white, ready to start the engine. Megan's voice trembled from outside the van. "Don't move. Don't give it reason." I wanted to ask her what she meant, but I stayed silent, frozen, listening to the sound of our campsite being dismantled by hands or claws we could not see. The sound of splitting wood dragged on for what felt like hours, but maybe it was only minutes. Each crack sent a shudder down my spine, because it wasn't random. It was measured. Like whoever or whatever was out there was taking it, savoring it. Sometimes it sounded close, just beyond the van, the crunch of footsteps heavy enough to shift the soil. Then it drifted farther, out past the creek, fading into the black where the lantern light couldn't reach. Scout barked once, sharp and panicked, but Megan hushed him immediately, pressing her hands against his muzzle. I don't know how long I sat there gripping the keys, staring at the fogged glass. Every muscle screamed to run, but the weight of that silence pinned me down. At some point, exhaustion claimed me. My body gave in, though my mind fought to stay awake. I must have dozed off in the van seat because when I opened my eyes again, the first pale stripe of dawn was creeping across the horizon. The world looked still, deceptively normal. But when I stepped outside, I knew we weren't imagining any of it. The fire pit was gone, not emptied, gone. The entire circle of stones we'd set, the scorched ground beneath it, even the pile of dirt Josh had shoveled over the smoke the night before, all of it had been stripped away, as if someone had scooped the whole thing clean and carried it off. What remained was a shallow hollow in the earth, smooth at the bottom, almost polished. The sight of it made my throat tighten because there was no way to explain it. Fire pits don't just vanish. Josh swore under his breath and started kicking at the dirt, like maybe if he showed enough anger, it would undo what had happened. Megan stood stiff beside Scout, who was whining and tugging at his leash, trying to pull her toward the van. She wouldn't meet my eyes. She just kept looking at the hollow, her face pale, lips trembling. By midday, we decided to leave. There was no debate left. We packed fast, stuffing gear into the van and throwing Josh's tent into the back like we couldn't get out of there quickly enough. The mountain road twisted down toward the park exit, and I remember how we all sat in silence, each of us too lost in thought to speak. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was watching us leave, that the silence pressing against the van windows was heavier than before. We pulled off at a small ranger station, thinking maybe we'd report what we'd seen. But when we went inside, the building was empty. No ranger, no logbook open on the desk, just silence and a faint smell of smoke, sharp and metallic, clinging to the wooden walls. Josh muttered something about budget cuts, about staff shortages. But Megan looked at me then, really looked at me. And I saw her fear mirrored in my own. We backed out, closing the door softly as if not to disturb whatever had lingered inside. That night, we stayed in a motel outside the park boundary, a cheap roadside place with buzzing neon and thin walls, but I swear I never felt safer. I thought maybe, just maybe, the mountain couldn't follow us there, that it would keep its silence, its disappearing campsites hidden in the trees where it belonged. But safety didn't last. Around 2 a.m, I woke to a sound I couldn't mistake. 3 deliberate knocks, heavy and hollow against the wall just outside my room. I bolted upright, staring at the door, at the thin curtains fluttering in the draft. My heart pounded so loud I thought it might wake the others. I told myself it was nothing, a drunk guest, the wind slamming loose siding. But then came the smell, faint then stronger. That same acrid stench of burned wood and plastic, seeping through the walls, filling my lungs. I didn't sleep again. None of us did. In the morning, I found Megan and Josh in the lobby, both looking like they hadn't closed their eyes either. They didn't need to say it. I knew they'd heard it too. We drove separate ways that morning. Josh and Megan headed south with Scout. I turned west, toward the coast, needing distance, needing space. But the mountain didn't leave me. Even now, months later, every time I close my eyes in silence, I hear those knocks. Sometimes faint, sometimes so loud it feels like the walls of my van are shaking. And when I wake in the night, there's always the same smell, lingering, waiting. That scorched, bitter air that reminds me the fire pits were never just fire pits. I don't know what's happening on Mount Rainier. I don't know what took those campers or why the ground itself bears the marks of something feeding. But I know this: the mountain is not empty. It is not silent. And if you camp there, if you build your fire, if you think you are safe beneath its crown of snow, you should know. You might wake to find the flames gone, the woods stolen, the silence pressing in until you realize the mountain has noticed you. And once it notices you, it doesn't let go. I kept driving after that mile after mile, watching the trees thin out and the landscape flatten, but the weight in my chest didn't lift. The Volkswagen's engine hummed steady beneath me, the one sound I could still trust. But even then, I couldn't escape the sense that something unseen was pacing me, keeping time with each turn of the wheels. Every time I stopped, to grab gas, to eat a sandwich in some parking lot, I caught myself scanning the edges of the lot, the tree lines, even the shadows beneath other cars. Looking for what, I didn't know. I just knew it wasn't done with me. That night, I parked at a coastal campground near the ocean. The salt air was sharp, the waves loud, the gulls crying overhead. I thought maybe the sea could drown out what the mountain had left in me. Maybe the constant rhythm of water would wash the silence from my ears. I set up slow, cooking pasta on the camp stove, pretending I was fine. But as the sun set and the horizon turned bruised purple, I realized I hadn't started a fire. My hands hesitated over the matches, frozen. The thought of striking flame, of building another circle of wood and stone twisted my stomach. All I could see was blackened ground, hollow pits, smoke rising in silence. I packed the matches away and sat in the dark instead. But the dark didn't save me. Around midnight, just as the tide rolled higher, I heard it again. Not from the forest this time, but from the beach itself. 3 knocks, deliberate, echoing over the roar of the waves. I pressed my forehead against the van window, heart hammering, and strained to see. The surf foamed white in the moonlight, the sand stretched empty, but the sound carried clearly. Knock, 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 like something buried beneath the sand was announcing itself. I told myself to leave, to get in the driver's seat and go, but I couldn't. My legs were heavy, my breath shallow. All I could do was sit there, every nerve in my body stretched tight, listening as the knocks repeated, closer this time, as though crawling up the shore. When they finally stopped, the silence didn't feel like relief. It felt like a promise. The next morning, the campsite next to mine was empty. The family who'd been there, a father, a mother, 2 kids who'd played frisbee on the grass the evening before, were gone. Their RV, their chairs, their cooler, all vanished. What was left was a patch of ground near the fire pit, blackened and cracked, still warm when I touched it. I staggered back, bile rising in my throat. It wasn't just Rainier. Whatever this was, it was following. I didn't stay another night. I drove for hours down the coast, across small towns, through stretches of farmland where the Volkswagen rattled on uneven roads. I kept moving, thinking if I didn't stop, it couldn't find me. But deep down, I knew running wasn't enough. You can't outrun something that doesn't live in the trees or the soil alone. You can't outrun something that remembers you. Weeks passed like that, driving, camping, avoiding fires, never staying longer than a night. Sleep came in fractured bursts, broken by sounds, knocks on the van, scraping outside, sometimes just the sharp snap of wood splitting in the distance. The smell followed too, slipping in through vents, curling into my clothes, reminding me I was never far enough away. I started to wonder if it was me now, if I'd carried it out with me, like a sickness or a shadow that had rooted itself in my skin. One night, somewhere in Utah, I stopped at a rest area to sleep. No campground this time, just a row of trucks under buzzing lamps. I thought maybe I'd outsmarted it by sticking close to concrete and strangers. But around 3 a.m, I woke to the sound of knocking again. Not from outside this time, but from beneath the van. Hollow thuds against the undercarriage, rattling through the floor where I sat. I dropped down, pressed my cheek to the cold metal, and felt it vibrate under each strike. My heart thrashed so violently I thought it would tear me apart. I didn't last there either. I started the van, engine roaring too loud, and sped out of that rest area like I was being chased. And maybe I was. Now, I'm telling this story because silence doesn't protect me anymore. I've tried holding it in, keeping it to myself, pretending I imagined it, but the more I deny it, the stronger it gets. I've realized this thing, whatever it is, doesn't just feed on wood or fire. It feeds on our disbelief, on the gaps where we fail to look closely enough. It thrives in silence, in the places we refuse to name. So here it is, named, spoken. Maybe that will weaken it. Maybe it won't. All I know is, if you're out there with your Volkswagen, if you're pulling into a campground and stacking wood for a fire, you need to remember what I've said. If you wake in the night and your firewood is gone, if you smell something sharp and chemical where it shouldn't be, if you hear those knocks 3 in a row, patient and certain, don't stay. Don't wait for answers. Don't hope it will pass you by, because it won't. It marks you the moment you notice it. And once you're marked, every fire you build, every circle of stones, every flicker of flame in the night is just an invitation for it to return. I used to think camping was freedom, that the road and the woods could heal you, teach you, strip away the noise of the world until all that was left was yourself and the sky. But now I know better. The road doesn't always set you free. Sometimes it leads you straight into the shadows where silence isn't peace at all. It's hunger, and hunger never stops. I don't know how long it's been since Mount Rainier. Weeks, months, maybe longer. Time has blurred into one long stretch of roads and empty campsites. I still drive my Volkswagen because leaving it behind feels impossible, like I'd be cutting away the only part of me that still feels solid. But every mile I travel, every night I spend in that van carries the weight of what happened. And if I'm honest with myself, I don't think the mountain ever let me go. I've tried to tell myself that what we saw, what we lost, was just some trick of nature, some freak fire that scarred the ground and spooked us out of our minds. But deep down I know the truth. I've seen too much, heard too much, smelled that burning stench in too many places where it doesn't belong. It isn't tied to Rainier alone. It's bigger than that. It's something that follows the flame itself, something that notices the moment we build light in the dark and decides it wants more. Sometimes I think about those campers who vanished. The couple next to us, the pickup truck down the loop, that family on the coast, their children laughing hours before the ground swallowed their fire pit whole. I wonder if they knew in those last moments that it wasn't people taking them, that it wasn't even the mountain, not exactly. It was something older, something patient, moving through the silence with a hunger too big for us to imagine. And I wonder if they fought, or if they simply disappeared, leaving behind nothing but blackened earth to tell the story. Every time I pass a campground now, I feel the urge to stop, to warn whoever is there, to tell them not to build their fire, not to stack their wood, not to mistake silence for safety. But who would listen? Who would believe a man rambling about disappearing campsites and vanishing fire pits? They'd laugh, the same way I used to laugh when people told ghost stories around the flames. They'd say I was tired, paranoid, maybe even broken. And maybe I am. But broken men don't imagine the smell of smoke curling under motel doors. Broken men don't wake to knocks that shake the floorboards of their van. So I've learned to live with it, if living is the right word. I don't light fires anymore. I eat cold meals, huddle in the van, let the darkness surround me without defiance. Some nights it passes me by. Other nights the knocks come, slow and certain, reminding me it hasn't forgotten. And each time I think, maybe it's not fire it wants anymore. Maybe eventually it will want me. Still, I keep moving. Maybe because I'm afraid that if I stop too long, it will find the strength to take me fully. Maybe because some stubborn part of me still believes there's a way to outlast it. The van rattles along the back roads, the trees blur by, the sky opens wide above me, and I pretend that I'm just another traveler chasing the horizon. Pretend that I can still love the road the way I once did. But then the silence comes. That heavy, suffocating silence that isn't peace, but pressure, pressing against my ears until my pulse feels too loud. And I know I'm not free. None of us are. Not when we sit by the fire and call it safety. Not when we let the glow fool us into thinking we've pushed the darkness back, because the darkness doesn't retreat. It watches, it waits. So if you're listening to this, if you've ever thought about driving up into the mountains, parking your Volkswagen beneath the stars, and building a fire to keep the night at bay, I'm begging you, pay attention. If you see the ground scorched blacker than it should be, if you wake to find your woodpile gone, if you hear 3 knocks in the silence of the trees, don't brush it off. Don't tell yourself it's nothing. Don't wait to be sure. Get in your van, turn the key, drive, because some fires are not meant to be lit. Some silences are not meant to be filled. And once the mountain notices you, once that hunger finds you, you'll understand, as I did, that not everything which disappears is truly gone. Sometimes it's just waiting to return. And when it does, you'll know, by the silence, by the smell, by the knocking that never stops. That's what I carry with me now. Not just the fear, but the knowledge. The kind of knowledge that burns deeper than fire and lingers longer than smoke. The kind of knowledge you can't put back once it's in you. And maybe that's my purpose now, not to escape it, because I don't think I ever will, but to leave this warning behind. A voice carried farther than my van can go. A reminder carved into the silence so you'll know when the time comes what to do. Don't wait. Don't wonder. Don't light the fire. Because if you do, you'll see what I saw. You'll feel what I felt. And you'll learn, as I did, that on Mount Rainier and anywhere the shadows of fire fall, the disappearing campfires are not the end. They're the beginning. I never thought the places we park our RVs, the campgrounds scattered across this country like quiet, resting places for weary travelers, could hold a history darker than the forest around them. My name is Aaron, I'm 43 years old, and I've been camping in a vintage Volkswagen Westphalia for the better part of 2 decades. I live mostly on the road now, an endless migration from one campground to another, always searching for a place that feels both safe and alive. I thought I knew the story of RV parks, how they sprouted in the post-war years, an answer to America's hunger for mobility, a way for families to stretch their legs across open highways and see the world from behind the windshield. But last summer, on a lonely stretch of land in Arizona, I learned there was another story, one that hides beneath the gravel pads and picnic tables, one whispered in old documents and in the soil itself. And once you hear it, you can't quite sleep the same way in your camper again. It started with a rumor. I was camped outside of Winslow in a half-forgotten RV park that felt more like a graveyard than a campground. The hookups barely worked, the water spigots coughed rust, and the office had long since closed its doors. A faded sign read Sunset Plains RV Haven, but the only thing resembling a sunset there was the washed-out paint peeling from every surface. There were maybe 3 other rigs parked in the gravel lot, each of them looking abandoned themselves. Windows covered, tires flat, air around them heavy with the smell of mildew. That night, an older man named Bill, who said he had worked construction on parks back in the 70s, joined me by the fire. His hands trembled when he lifted his beer, and the flames etched deep lines into his weathered face. He told me something I couldn't shake. "Ever heard of Mr. Volkswagen?" he asked, leaning closer like the shadows might be listening. Not the car, not the company. A man. He wasn't German, not even European, but he's the one who started a lot of these parks. He had a reason, and it wasn't to make families happy. At first, I thought Bill was just weaving campfire nonsense. Every old-timer on the road has a story, and most of them are tall. But when he said the man's name, Jonas Volka, I felt something in the air shift. He said Volka had been building places for travelers long before the RV boom, and that his designs always carried certain traits. Circular layouts, odd spacing between lots, and in some cases, the deliberate planting of trees in patterns that looked like sigils when viewed from above. Bill claimed Volka's first park wasn't even registered on state records, but it existed, hidden somewhere in the desert, and people who camped there often didn't leave the same way they arrived. Some never left at all. I couldn't let it go. The way Bill's voice cracked, the way his eyes darted into the darkness, made me believe he wasn't lying. And when you live on the road long enough, you learn the truth isn't always found in guidebooks or websites. It's in stories passed hand to hand across picnic tables, whispered at campfires, scratched into bathroom stalls. The next morning, I walked the grounds of Sunset Plains trying to see what Bill meant. The place was laid out in a rough circle, RV pads arranged like spokes on a wheel. At the center, an old concrete slab cracked with weeds. No one parked there, not because there wasn't room, but because something about it felt wrong, like standing on it would mean offering yourself up to something unseen. I left quickly, telling myself I was chasing a story, not running from a ghost. But when I closed my sliding van door that night, I swear I heard footsteps circling the van, even though no gravel crunched, no shadow passed by the windows, just the sound of presence. Curiosity took me deeper. A week later, I was in New Mexico, tracing down mentions of Jonas Volke at local libraries. There were scraps of newspaper clippings, odd references in land deeds, hints of parks that had been proposed and then never built. Each time his name appeared, there was something unfinished. Projects left half-complete, land left scarred. The strangest thing, some articles suggested Volke had died in 1938, long before the post-war RV craze. But his signature parks continued to be built well into the 1960s. Either someone else carried his name forward, or someone never truly stopped. By the time I reached Colorado, I was obsessed. My journal was filled with sketches of park layouts, notes on spacing, alignments. I started noticing that some of the oldest parks, the ones you barely find listed online anymore, all shared a strange silence at night. No matter how many campers filled the lots, once the firewood burned out and the engines cooled, the air pressed down heavy, like the earth itself was waiting. I don't scare easy. I've slept in Walmart parking lots with strangers knocking at 3 a.m., but these places, they made me question whether I should even close my eyes. One night, I parked in a small site near Durango. The pads were laid in a perfect oval, and at the far end, a massive cottonwood tree stood alone, its trunk split by lightning long ago. As the sun fell, the camp grew quieter than usual. Families who had been laughing around grills earlier now sat stiff, as if the darkness itself had taken something from them. I climbed into my van, pulled the curtains shut, and tried to write, but my hand wouldn't stop shaking. Then came the tapping. Soft, deliberate knocks against the metal siding of my Volkswagen. First 3, then 4. I flung the door open, flashlight in hand, but the circle outside was empty. The tree loomed, split trunk gaping like a mouth. I wanted to leave that instant, but something held me in place. It felt like Volke's design had teeth, and I had driven willingly into its jaw. The deeper I went, the more the history turned against me. Old letters hinted that Volke had worked with surveyors who believed certain landscapes carried memory, that if you built on them with the right geometry, you could trap not just people, but time. Some whispered he'd been involved in seances, others that he promised investors his parks would never lose guests. None of it made sense in daylight, but at 2 a.m., when your RV creaks in the stillness, you start to wonder whether you're just another part of that promise. I began questioning everything. Why were some of the oldest parks abandoned so suddenly, as if families just vanished mid-trip? Why did state records list certain tracts of land as restricted with no explanation? And why, every time I drove out of one of these places, did I feel lighter, like something unseen had been holding me down, and only when I hit the highway did I finally breathe again? The scariest part wasn't the silence, or the footsteps, or even the knocks. It was the feeling that I was being studied, that some mind, old and patient, was watching through the crooked trees and rusted electrical posts, taking notes as I moved, as if I too was just another traveler who might not make it back onto the open road. I told myself I could stop anytime, that the research was just curiosity, nothing more. But the truth is it had become something else. It had become an obsession, and obsessions don't let go easily. My van wasn't just carrying me down highways anymore. It was carrying the weight of every rumor, every scrap of history I uncovered about Jonas Volke, the so-called Mr. I Volkswagen. And the road itself began to feel different, like the asphalt remembered the wheels of every family who had vanished into those forgotten parks. It was in Utah where I found the first real evidence. I stopped at a small desert town called Green River, the kind of place where people sit on porches long after the sun dips behind the mesas, as if keeping watch over something they don't talk about. At the local archive, buried in boxes of property surveys, I found blueprints. They weren't labeled with his name, but I recognized the layout instantly. A perfect circle of lots, each equidistant, with a central clearing marked common area. Except the notes on the margins weren't about plumbing or electricity. They were about alignments, celestial tracking, and a phrase that sent a chill into my spine: points of retention. When I asked the clerk about it, her eyes flickered with something close to fear. "You don't want to camp in those places," she said flatly, sliding the folder back toward me like it was a live snake. "People go missing there. Always have. The sheriff won't file reports anymore. It's just understood." I wanted to ask more, but I saw the way her hands shook. It was the same tremor Bill had when he spoke at Sunset Plains. They weren't just passing stories along. They were carrying something heavier, a burden they didn't want but couldn't put down. That night, I pulled into a dusty, half-abandoned park just outside town. The sign had fallen long ago, its posts jutting from the desert like bones. I was the only camper there. The pads stretched in a wide circle, and the desert wind funneled through the ring like a breath drawn in and never released. I parked reluctantly, telling myself it was just for the night, just for the story. But once darkness set in, the place came alive in ways I couldn't explain. It wasn't sound this time, it was weight, as if the air itself thickened, pressing down on my chest until every breath burned. My Volkswagen creaked, suspension groaning like something heavy had climbed onto it. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, refusing to close my eyes. Then I heard it, a dragging noise, slow and deliberate, circling the van. Not footsteps, not paws. More like something pulling itself around the gravel, as if reluctant to leave or eager to stay. I bolted upright, yanked the curtains, and shined my flashlight. Nothing. Just desert shrubs swaying in the wind, stars unblinking overhead. But when I killed the light, the sound returned. Always circling. Always the same distance from the van. I didn't sleep that night. At dawn, when the sky bled orange, I started the engine and drove without looking back. But even miles down the highway, I swore I could still hear it, that dragging sound, like it had latched onto my tires and followed. The next weeks blurred into one long hunt. I stopped at libraries, courthouses, roadside diners where the walls were lined with yellowed photographs. Each place added a piece to the puzzle. Volke had moved west in the early 1900s, working first as a surveyor, then as a developer of traveler camps. His parks predated RVs entirely, originally designed for wagons, then automobiles. The layouts never changed, though. Always circles, always a center, and always land that locals whispered about long before he bought it. In Montana, I found a letter written by a priest in 1922, warning parishioners not to stay at one of Volke's camps. He wrote that the ground was unconsecrated, that it drank more than water. Families who stopped there often reported nightmares, strange illnesses, or a feeling of being pulled from themselves. I thought about all the times I had camped alone, all the nights I'd ignored my instincts because I didn't want to seem paranoid. How many times had I been lucky, simply because I hadn't parked in the wrong circle? The scariest moment came in Idaho. I found myself in an old park hidden off a forest road, no longer maintained but still accessible if you knew where to turn. The paths were cracked, moss swallowing the edges, but the circle was unmistakable. I parked, telling myself I wouldn't stay the night. I just wanted photographs for my notes. But as I walked toward the center clearing, I noticed the ground was blackened, scorched in a way that no fire pit could explain. It radiated outward in lines, like spokes, And at the center of it all, I found something I'll never forget. A plaque, half buried, stamped with a name, Volca Holdings, 1936. The ground seemed to hum beneath my boots. Not loudly, not even audibly, more like a vibration in my bones, a whisper in my teeth. My body knew before my mind did. I wasn't supposed to stand there. I stumbled back to the van, heart racing, and that's when I saw them, shapes in the tree line. Not people exactly. Too tall, too thin. They didn't move like animals either. They just watched, utterly still, as if waiting to see whether I would leave on my own or need convincing. I drove out fast, tires spitting gravel, but in the rearview mirror I swore I saw the trees bending, as if something enormous and invisible was pushing through. By then, my obsession had turned into fear. I started to dream about circles, endless circles, spinning until I woke in a sweat. In one dream, I saw Volca himself. He was standing in the middle of an empty park, arms stretched wide, welcoming travelers into a place they would never escape. His eyes weren't cruel, though. They were patient, like he believed he was keeping a promise, fulfilling some duty no one else understood. I wanted answers, not just whispers, not just fragments. I needed to know what these places really were. And that need drove me to the one park I swore I would never enter, the one Bill had hinted at on that first night in Arizona. The original, the one not on any map. Locals near Winslow called it Haven of the Road. They said it had been built before the interstate system, before Route 66 even hit its stride. The land was fenced off now, claimed by the state, but no one patrolled it. People said it was cursed ground, and even the most daring campers left it alone. I found the fence easily enough, rusted chain link curling into the sand. My flashlight cut through the dark as I stepped over, crunching onto gravel so old it felt fossilized. And there it was, the circle. Perfect, wide, stone markers set like teeth around the perimeter. At the center, not a slab this time, but a pit. 10 feet across, 5 feet deep, lined with stones blackened by age. The air was different there. Heavier, colder. My breath fogged even though the desert night was warm. I walked to the edge of the pit and felt something shift beneath me, like the ground inhaled. I stumbled back, heart slamming, and that's when I realized I wasn't alone. On the opposite side of the pit, a figure stood, tall, thin, wearing clothes decades out of time. He didn't move, didn't breathe, just stood there, watching me. His face was obscured by the dark, but the outline of his hat, broad-brimmed, old-fashioned, matched the description I'd read of Volca in one of those faded clippings. I blinked, and he was gone. But the pit remained, breathing in silence, waiting. I could have run then. I should have. Every instinct in me screamed to get back in my Volkswagen, slam the door, and put as many miles as I could between myself and that circle. But obsession is a dangerous thing. It convinces you that answers are worth more than safety. And so I stayed, rooted to the edge of that pit, trembling as if the earth itself had caught me in its grip. The silence pressed against my eardrums until it wasn't silence anymore. It was a kind of hum, low and constant, as if the ground beneath was alive. The longer I stood there, the stronger it became, crawling up through my boots, into my knees, rattling in my ribcage. I couldn't shake the thought that maybe this was what Volca wanted, that he had built these places to feed the earth, or maybe to feed something beneath it. I whispered his name out loud, Jonas Volca. The sound seemed swallowed instantly, devoured before it could echo. My throat tightened, dry as dust. I'd spoken it dozens of times before in research, in libraries, in quiet camps, but here it felt like a ritual, like an invocation. The pit exhaled. No wind stirred, no leaves rustled, but my hair lifted at the nape of my neck as if a current of cold air had risen out of the ground. I staggered back, my flashlight trembling across the stone markers, and that's when I saw them. Carvings. Each marker bore a different symbol, weathered almost to nothing but still visible under the beam. Circles inside circles, spirals and shapes that looked like eyes. They weren't decorative, they weren't accidental. They were meant to bind something in place, or let it out. And suddenly I remembered what Bill had told me that first night. He had a reason. and it wasn't to make families happy. I don't remember falling to my knees, but I found myself crouched low, breath shallow, staring at those carvings as if they might rearrange into words if I looked long enough. My body felt drained, as if hours had passed though only minutes had slipped by. I forced myself up, staggered toward the van, and froze at the sound of gravel crunching behind me. I turned. He was there again, the tall figure in the broad-brimmed hat, standing by the pit. This time closer, close enough that the beam of my light fell across him. And what I saw didn't make sense. His clothes were tattered, the kind you'd expect from the 1930s, suspenders, a long coat that fluttered, though no wind blew. His face, though, was smooth, too smooth, no features at all, like someone had erased him. Just a blank oval where eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The featureless face tilted slightly, like he was studying me, or maybe mocking my terror. And then he lifted a hand, long and pale, and pointed toward the pit. "No," I croaked, barely recognizing my own voice. "I'm not." The ground shifted, groaned like a stomach rumbling beneath stone. And I understood. This was why the parks were built, why the circles kept appearing across the country. They weren't just for camping, they were feeding stations, places where people stopped willingly, parked their homes on wheels right over the geometry, and gave themselves to something that waited patiently below. I turned and ran. My van door slammed, engine roared, gravel spat out behind the tires. I didn't look back, not once. My rearview mirror showed only darkness, but in my gut I knew he was still standing there, still pointing, still waiting for me to make the mistake of returning. For 3 states I drove without stopping, sleeping only in daylight, pulling over at gas stations rather than campgrounds. I thought distance would help, that if I put enough miles between myself and haven of the road, the memory would fade. But obsession doesn't fade, it changes shape. Now every RV park I pass feels suspect. Every circular arrangement of pads, every solitary tree at the center, every unnatural silence after dark. I see Volka's signature everywhere, and I wonder how many people know the truth. I began to ask other campers carefully, testing the waters. Most laughed it off, but a few grew serious, eyes darkening as if they too had heard the hum of the ground. One woman told me her grandfather disappeared in a park outside Flagstaff in 1962, left his trailer locked, his keys inside, his shoes by the door, gone without a trace. "They said he ran off," she whispered. "But we know he didn't. The land kept him." The land kept him. Those words burrowed into me. Maybe that was Volka's unknown history. Not just the man, but the belief that America's restless families weren't traveling free at all. They were being herded, guided to circles that fed something older than highways and older than our engines. I returned once more to my notes, spreading them across my van's small table. Blueprints, clippings, sketches, testimonies. The circles connected like constellations across the map, stretching from desert to forest to coast, and at the center of it all was a pattern that looked disturbingly familiar. A wheel. Just like the wheel of a Volkswagen bus, spokes radiating outward, turning endlessly. That night, parked in a Walmart lot under buzzing fluorescent lights, I dreamed again. I was standing in the center of a circle, campers all around me, their doors open, their curtains fluttering. Families stood beside their rigs, silent, featureless, eyes turned down toward the ground. And in the pit, something vast shifted, a shadow too large to comprehend. Volka stood beside me, hand on my shoulder, faceless head tilted toward the sky. And in the distance I could hear engines, dozens, hundreds approaching. "More travelers, more guests," he whispered without a mouth. "They will never leave. None of us ever do." I woke gasping, drenched in sweat. My van smelled of soil, damp and ancient. Though I hadn't been near a forest in weeks and weeks. My hands were trembling, and when I looked down, I saw faint dust smears on my palms as if I'd been digging in the dark. I don't know what Volka was, man, myth, or something else, but I know the parks carry his design, his intent. And I know the land remembers. The silence at night, the knocks on the siding, the feeling that something studies you through the trees. It isn't your imagination. It's the circle working, always working, turning like a wheel that never stops. And maybe that's the truth about RV life that no guidebook tells you. We think we're chasing freedom, parking under stars to claim a piece of open country. But maybe we're just following grooves laid long before us, driven not by choice, but by design. The history of RV parks isn't just about convenience or community. It's about a man who knew how to shape land into a trap, a man whose name twisted into Volkswagen, not by company, but by legend, a man who built havens not for the road weary, but for whatever waited beneath the road itself. And as I drive tonight, headlights cutting through the desert, I wonder if I'll ever truly escape him. Because every circle I see reminds me that he's still out there, faceless and patient, waiting for me to stop moving long enough to join the silence. And maybe one night, I will. I've thought about quitting the road more times than I can count. Thought about selling the van, trading in the endless horizon for four walls that don't move and a bed that never shifts with the wind. But when I stand still too long, I feel it. The pull. The hum. Like the ground beneath me is restless, reminding me that the history I uncovered isn't finished. Not for me, and maybe not for anyone who dares to keep moving. The more I dug, the clearer it became. Volca's legacy was not just scattered parks. It was a network. Each campground, each circle, each pit or slab connected like a chain across the country. And if you drove long enough, if you followed the rhythm of the road without questioning, you'd eventually pass through more of them than you realized. Some disguised as polished resorts with manicured lawns. Some as forgotten lots where weeds choked the gravel. But the design was always there, waiting, as if America's great dream of travel had been built on something far older and far darker. I began to notice things that I'd once ignored. Families who checked in at parks but never seemed to check out. Campground managers who kept no records, who shrugged when I asked about guests who had disappeared. Places where animals refused to linger. No birds at dusk. No coyotes howling from the ridge. Only silence as thick as stone. And the worst realization of all, the circles weren't confined to parks. I began to see them in cul-de-sacs, in city planning, in farmland irrigation patterns. Once you know the geometry, you see it everywhere. It's as though Volca hadn't simply designed parks. He'd taught the land itself how to hold us, how to keep us circling without end. One night outside Kansas, I parked at a small family-owned lot. Nothing strange at first, just gravel, hookups, a row of trees marking the property line. I was tired, too tired to search for anything ominous. I thought maybe this night would be different. Maybe I could rest. But at 2 a.m, I woke to find every light in the van flickering. My phone screen glowed with no battery. The stove sparked, though it was off. The hum was back, crawling through the appliances like static, and outside I heard whispers. Not words, not voices I could recognize, just the suggestion of language, rising and falling, circling the van. I sat frozen, holding my breath until suddenly the lights died. Silence swallowed everything. I thought it was over until I heard the softest tap at the window. Not demanding, not threatening, almost polite. I forced myself to look, and through the glass I saw a reflection that wasn't mine. A man in a broad-brimmed hat, faceless, standing inches away. He didn't move, didn't breathe. Just waited until I blinked and he was gone. I drove out before dawn, heart hammering, and I realized the truth. I can't escape him, not completely, because I've spoken his name, walked his circles, stood at the edge of his pit. I've acknowledged him, and that makes me part of the story now, but maybe that's why I have to keep telling it. I don't know if Volca was a man who bargained with something deep in the earth, or if he was just its messenger, laying down circles so the rest of us could be delivered to it willingly. I don't know if the faceless figure is him, or what became of him, or something far older wearing his shape, but I know this. Our parks, our campgrounds, our safe havens on the road, they aren't always what they seem. And when you pull into one, when you park and settle in, listen. Really listen. If the silence feels too heavy, if the air vibrates in your chest, if your instincts whisper that something isn't right, Trust that. Don't dismiss it. Don't stay just because it's convenient. Because some history doesn't live in books or archives. Some history lives in the land itself. And once you park in it, it remembers you. Tonight, as I record this, I'm parked at a rest stop instead of a campground. The air smells of diesel, trucks roar past every few minutes, and the lights buzz overhead. It's ugly, it's noisy, it's imperfect, but it's safe. Because safety doesn't always come wrapped in comfort. Sometimes safety is choosing the harder path, listening to the unease rather than ignoring it. I still carry the lessons of Jonas Volka with me, not as a curse, but as a reminder that freedom is fragile, that history isn't always what we're told, and that the road can either set you free or claim you for itself. When I close my eyes, I still see him sometimes, standing in the dark, hat tilted, pointing toward the pit, waiting. I don't think he'll ever stop, but maybe that's the point. Maybe the road was never meant to be finished. Maybe the real test is whether we keep moving, whether we refuse to be swallowed by the circles laid down before us. So when you pull into your next RV park, when you hook up the water and settle in for the night, I want you to remember this story. Remember the silence, remember the hum, and ask yourself, is this really a place to rest? Or just another circle waiting to close? Because the history of RV parks isn't just a story of travel and leisure. It's a story of control, of design, of a man whose unknown past still lingers beneath our tires. And every time we stop, every time we park, we take the risk of joining that history. And maybe that's the scariest truth of all. I'm Aaron, 43 years old, a man who thought he knew the road until I learned who built it. And if you ever hear the hum, if you ever feel the silence grow too heavy, if you ever see a faceless man watching from the tree line, don't wait. Don't rationalize. Don't tell yourself it's nothing. Start the engine. Leave. Keep moving. Because once the circle closes, there may be no leaving at all. The rain was already falling when I pulled the Volkswagen into the moss-darkened pullout, its drops striking the roof in uneven rhythms that felt more alive than weather. I remember cutting the ignition and sitting there for a moment longer than I needed to, hands on the wheel, the smell of wet cedar seeping in through the cracked window. My name is Aaron, I'm 34, and that night I thought I had chosen the perfect place to camp, a place people in Washington whisper about as the Green Cathedral, a name that sounded more like reverence than warning. I had driven for hours into the Olympic Peninsula, chasing solitude, chasing silence. What I found was something else entirely. The forest had a weight to it. That's the only way I can describe it. The way the moss swallowed every sound, the way the trees leaned inward as if to keep out what didn't belong. I stepped out of the van, boots sinking slightly into the spongy soil, and the air was thick with the damp perfume of rot and pine. Even the Volkswagen's yellow paint looked muted under the gray canopy, as if color itself had no permission to exist here. I wasn't running away from anything in particular, but I was restless. Too many nights in the city listening to the drone of traffic instead of the breath of the wild. I thought I needed quiet. I thought I needed to hear myself think again. So when I found that unmarked spur road curling into the deeper woods, I took it. No campsite markers, no amenities, just earth and trees and the steady drum of rain. I told myself this was freedom. The first odd thing happened within minutes of setting up. I was unrolling the awning from the van when I noticed how uneven the sounds of the forest were. The rain was steady, but underneath it, the usual forest noises were strangely absent. No chatter of birds, no shrill of insects, just the occasional groan of the branches as though the trees themselves were shifting against one another. I told myself maybe the rain had driven the wildlife into silence. Still, I couldn't shake the sense that the quiet was deliberate, like a held breath. I cooked inside the van that night, just some canned chili on the little propane stove. The smell of it filled the space, mixing with the damp wool of my jacket and the faint gasoline scent from the jerry cans strapped on the back, comforting in its way. I ate slowly, listening to the rain tap in strange rhythms, sometimes light, sometimes with sudden heavy bursts that rattled the roof like hands knocking to be let in. By the time I washed the dishes in a little basin, night had swallowed the clearing entirely. Out here, away from roads or towns, the darkness wasn't just absence of light, it was something dense, like velvet pressing against the windows. I lit a lantern, its glow casting soft halos across the interior. I told myself I'd read for an hour, but I couldn't concentrate. Every few minutes, I caught myself lowering the book, tilting my head, straining to hear through the rain. A faint sound had begun to surface beneath it, a low murmur, like voices carried from very far off. At first, I thought it might be water moving underground or the shifting of the canopy in the wind, but it grew clearer as the hours passed. Tones, pauses, a rise and fall that my brain kept trying to shape into words. I fought the urge to open the door and step out to prove it was only imagination. Something in me resisted, an instinct that said, "Stay inside, don't answer." I told myself I was tired. That was all. I pulled the sleeping bag over myself, trying to bury the sound, but it threaded into my dreams until I wasn't sure if I was awake or asleep. I woke suddenly around 3 in the morning, heart pounding, with the sense that something had just been outside the van. The rain had stopped, leaving the world soaked and silent. The windows had fogged with my breath, but on the glass of the rear window, I could see streaks where the condensation had been disturbed, as though someone had dragged their fingers slowly down the surface. I sat frozen, afraid to move, afraid to breathe too loud. When I finally worked up the courage to step out, morning was close. The forest was drowned in mist, every branch dripping, the ground slick. I circled the van, expecting to find footprints. There were none. Just the moss, as untouched as if no one had ever stood there. I forced a laugh at myself, shook it off, told myself maybe the condensation had just shifted on its own. But in the back of my mind, I remembered the sound of rain knocking in irregular bursts, like fists on metal. That day I hiked into the woods, determined to prove to myself that I wasn't unraveling. I wanted to find a stream, something to wash the strange heaviness out of me. The trail was faint, barely visible under the wet undergrowth, but it led me deeper into the green cathedral. And it was then I noticed the trees. They weren't random. That's what struck me. They grew in curving lines, arching together to form shapes almost architectural, like doorways, like columns. And in the dim light filtering through the mist, they resembled the ribcage of some colossal creature, long buried in the earth. I found myself whispering without realizing it, my own voice trembling in that hushed space. Hours passed, though it felt like I had walked in circles. The same twisted cedar with a hollow trunk appeared again and again, no matter which direction I turned. By the time I made it back to the van, exhausted and wet, it was already near dusk. Relief washed over me at the sight of that yellow paint through the trees, but the relief was short-lived. Something had changed. Hanging from the side mirror was a small bundle of twigs, bound tightly with strips of moss. It hadn't been there when I left. I stared at it, heart thundering, every instinct screaming that this was no accident. I wanted to rip it down, but something inside me hesitated. Instead, I climbed into the van, locked the doors, and sat staring at it through the windshield as the forest darkened once more. That night, the voices returned, louder this time, insistent. The rhythm of them seemed to sync with my heartbeat, threading through my veins, making my skin crawl. I pressed my palms over my ears, but the sound was inside me now, not outside. It came from the very air, from the dripping moss, from the breath of the green cathedral itself. And for the first time since arriving, I understood that I wasn't just camping in the woods. I had stepped into something ancient, something that did not welcome me. I didn't sleep at all. I sat upright in the van, the lantern flickering on low, my fingers wrapped tight around the handle of the small hatchet I kept under the seat. Every few minutes I'd glance out the fogged windows, convinced I'd see someone or something standing in the mist. But the clearing was empty except for the dripping trees and that bundle of twigs swaying slightly from the side mirror. It felt like an offering and a warning at once, like something a child would leave on a doorstep before running away. By the time the sky began to lighten, the voices faded, as if dawn itself burned them away. My nerves were raw, my eyes gritty. I told myself I'd pack up and leave. I'd drive straight back to the highway, back to cell service, back to a world with edges I could trust. But when I stepped out of the van, something in the air changed, subtle but immediate, like walking into a room where someone had just been crying. The forest smelled different now. Not just wet earth and cedar, but a faint sweetness, almost floral, like blossoms rotting underwater. The mist was thicker, curling low and pale green in the dim light, clinging to my boots as I walked. When I reached for the twig bundle, I noticed it wasn't tied with moss after all, but with something more like hair, long, pale strands knotted tightly. My stomach turned. I ripped it down and hurled it into the trees, then climbed back into the van with shaking hands. The engine coughed twice before it started, as if reluctant. The radio hissed static. I pulled out of the clearing, my tires sinking slightly into the soft soil. The road back should have been easy, just a single dirt track leading to the main road. But after 5 minutes of driving, I realized something was wrong. The trees on either side of me looked the same as they had when I arrived, the same curving shapes, the same moss-choked trunks. I slowed, scanning for the landmarks I'd memorized. Nothing. I kept driving, my heart hammering. The road wound tighter, narrower, and then broke apart into 2 faint trails. I didn't remember a split like that on the way in. I stopped, leaning forward over the wheel. Left or right? Neither looked more used than the other. My gut said left, but the moment I turned the van, the mist swallowed the rearview mirror and the road behind me vanished into gray. Minutes stretched. The forest pressed closer. My headlights, still on from the fog, seemed to push against something heavy, as if the air itself resisted them. Then the static on the radio began to change. No longer random, but rhythmic. Bursts of noise, pauses, bursts again. A pattern like a heartbeat. I shut it off, but the sound continued faintly, as though it had burrowed into the wiring. I gripped the wheel tighter, muttering under my breath, "Get a grip, Aaron. It's just the forest. It's just fog." My voice sounded small, swallowed instantly. That's when I saw it. Another bundle of twigs, this one hanging from a branch at eye level, right in the middle of the road. It was larger than the first, its shape more deliberate. 3 sticks lashed into a triangle with something dark dangling in its center. I braked hard. The van slid slightly in the mud, stopping a few feet short. I couldn't bring myself to roll down the window. I only stared at it, the triangle turning slowly, dripping. The dark thing in the center was a feather, slick with rain, and when the wind moved it just right, it pointed directly at me. Something snapped inside. I threw the van into reverse, spinning the wheels, mud spattering against the sides. I backed up as far as I could, then swung the wheel and turned down the other trail. My pulse thundered in my ears. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to get away from that symbol, from that smell, from the sense that the forest was arranging itself around me. The trail narrowed further, branches scraping the sides of the van, the sound like fingernails on glass. I ducked instinctively as one snapped across the windshield. And then the ground dropped sharply, the tires bumping over roots, the van lurching forward. I slammed the brakes. In front of me, the road ended in a clearing I'd never seen before. It was circular, perfectly so, like a room without walls. The trees around it bent inward to form an arching canopy, their moss-laden branches meeting above in a vaulted ceiling of green. It was beautiful and terrifying at once. The green cathedral. I had found the heart of it, or it had brought me here. The smell of rot and sweetness was stronger now, almost dizzying. I could hear water dripping somewhere unseen, a steady echo like footsteps in another room. The ground was soft underfoot, covered in a thick carpet of moss, and at the center of the clearing stood something that made my stomach twist. It was a stump. At least, it began as a stump. But carved into it were figures, dozens of them, their features eroded but still recognizable as human faces. Eyes closed, mouths open, some smiling, some screaming. Moss grew over their lips, their brows, softening the expressions until they looked half asleep. Around the base of the stump lay more twig bundles, arranged in circles like offerings. I stepped out without meaning to, leaving the door of the van open behind me. My boots sank soundlessly into the moss. The air inside the green cathedral was warmer, almost humid, and every breath felt like inhaling through a damp cloth. As I moved closer to the carved stump, a faint vibration trembled through the ground, subtle enough to think it was my heartbeat, until it rose into sound. The voices. Not faint this time, not distant. They were everywhere, surrounding me, whispering from the moss, from the branches overhead, from the carved mouths of the wooden faces. Not words exactly, but syllables that rolled like water over stones, endless and old. My hands shook. My hatchet felt useless, absurd, like a toy. I wanted to run, but my feet carried me closer. My hand reached out, almost of its own accord, toward the stump. The moss on the carved faces was damp and soft under my fingers, and beneath that softness, something pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat buried in wood. Suddenly the whispers surged, a dozen voices becoming hundreds, a chorus rising in pitch until it felt like the air itself was vibrating. My vision blurred. The sweet smell thickened into something cloying, almost metallic. I stumbled back, gasping, my hands slick with moisture from the stump. Not rain, but something warmer. I turned and bolted for the van, my boots slipping on the moss. The voices followed, louder now, not from the forest, but from inside my own skull. I slammed the door, twisted the key, the engine roaring to life with a backfire like a gunshot. Headlights cut through the mist, and for a moment I saw shapes in it, tall, thin figures between the trees, unmoving, watching. I didn't look back again. I floored the accelerator, the van jolting over roots and mud as I tore out of the green cathedral. The trail ahead was a blur of gray and green. Branches whipped against the sides, the sound rising into a shriek. But the van didn't stop. I kept driving, knuckles white on the wheel, eyes locked on the faint ribbon of road ahead, praying it would lead me anywhere but deeper. The road didn't make sense anymore. No matter how fast I drove, how hard I pressed the pedal, the van seemed to crawl through the mist like an insect caught in amber. Every turn bled into another, every rise flattened into another slope. I kept expecting to break through to some gravel road, some trace of the highway, but the forest only thickened, branches arcing overhead until the sky was gone entirely. It felt less like I was escaping and more like I was being funneled. At one point, I swore the headlights illuminated the same cedar stump with the hollow trunk I'd passed the day before. I had marked it in my mind because of how its opening looked like a gaping mouth. Now it was here again, staring at me, water dripping down its sides like saliva. My stomach turned. I pressed harder on the accelerator, whispering to myself, just keep moving. Don't stop. Keep moving. My voice sounded strange, as if someone else were repeating it in perfect time, just behind my shoulder. The rain started again, sharp and sudden, hammering the roof of the van in rhythmic bursts. It wasn't steady rainfall. It was patterned. Knock, knock, pause. Knock, knock, knock. The rhythm of it crawled under my skin, too deliberate to be chance. I turned the wipers on full, but the windshield fogged instantly, the mist pressing from outside and my own breath steaming from inside. I had to lean forward to see the road at all. That's when the lights flickered. Not the van's lights, something in the trees. Pale glows, faint at first like lanterns swinging in the distance. They moved in pairs, drifting slowly between the trunks, sometimes closer, sometimes further. My chest tightened as I realized they weren't lanterns. They looked like eyes. I gripped the wheel so hard my knuckles ached. The glow faded when I focused directly on it, but whenever I looked away, the lights would bloom stronger, multiplying. Soon there were dozens of them, all keeping pace with the van as I drove. The voices returned too, faint, murmuring, but this time I could distinguish tone. Urgent, beckoning, like a crowd murmuring before a performance begins. I wanted to scream, to drown it out, but something inside me resisted. Some sick part of me wanted to listen, wanted to know what they were saying. I bit my tongue hard enough to taste blood, forcing myself to stay grounded. My foot never left the accelerator. Finally, after what felt like hours, the trail widened. Relief flickered in me when I spotted a sliver of something brighter ahead. Daylight? The highway? I nearly cried. The van burst out into another clearing, but my relief died instantly. It wasn't the highway. It wasn't freedom. It was the same clearing as before, the green cathedral. I slammed the brakes so hard I nearly cracked my teeth. The van skidded in the mud, stopping just yards from the carved stump with its moss-choked faces. I stared at it, my pulse roaring in my ears. It was impossible. I had driven away. I had chosen a different trail. And yet here it was, waiting for me like I'd never left. For a long moment, I couldn't move. I sat there trembling, headlights glaring across the clearing, illuminating the carved faces. And then, God help me, I saw them shift. One of the faces slowly opened its eyes. Moss fell away from the lids, revealing sockets too deep to see into. Another face's mouth twitched wider, stretching in a grotesque yawn. The voices surged, not distant, not outside, inside the van, inside me. My bones vibrated with it, my teeth aching as the sound rose into a chorus. It was overwhelming, suffocating, and in that moment, my instincts finally snapped into clarity. They wanted me to step out, to kneel before that stump, to give myself to whatever had been whispering through the rain. "No," I said aloud, my voice shaking. "You don't get me. Not me." I wrenched the wheel hard, spinning the van around, mud spraying. I didn't care about the road anymore, didn't care if the van rolled or broke. I drove straight into the trees, headlights slashing through branches, the van lurching violently as roots cracked under the tires. The sound of tearing metal screamed in my ears, branches clawing at the paint, but I didn't stop. The forest fought back. Limbs crashed against the windshield, one snapping it into a spiderweb of cracks. Moss and bark rained down on the roof. But I kept the pedal down, gripping the wheel like it was my lifeline. The voices screamed in my skull, demanding, pleading, promising, but I only roared back wordlessly, a sound of defiance, raw and animal. And then, just like that, the trees broke. The van burst out onto gravel, my headlights sweeping across the unmistakable shape of a Forest Service road sign. I nearly sobbed in relief. The radio shrieked with static, then cut out completely. The voices fell silent. The forest behind me was only trees again, black, dripping, endless. I didn't slow down. I drove until the mist thinned, until the rain softened into a drizzle, until the first pale light of dawn touched the horizon. By the time I reached a small ranger station, the van rattling and streaked with mud, I was shaking so badly I could barely climb out. The ranger on duty, an older woman with sharp eyes, took one look at me and asked if I was hurt. I told her I was fine. I wasn't. I didn't tell her what happened. How could I? I only asked the fastest way back to the main highway. She gave me directions, and before I left, she said something I can't shake even now. "You camped too deep, didn't you? Past the marked sites." I didn't answer. Her eyes softened a little, and she added, "The forest doesn't like that." I drove away without looking back. Even now, weeks later, the Green Cathedral lingers in me. The smell of damp moss still rises in my dreams. Sometimes, when the rain hits my apartment windows just right, I hear that knocking rhythm again. Knock, knock, pause, knock, knock, knock. My rational mind tells me it was just the forest playing tricks, exhaustion twisting my senses. But deep down, I know better. I know I was called, and I know I said no. That's what matters. The whispers are still there deep in those woods, waiting for anyone foolish enough to listen. But I left with my voice intact, my will unbroken. And if I ever return, and I swear I never will, I know what I'll carry with me. Not fear, not curiosity, just the memory of saying no, of refusing the call of something ancient and patient and hungry. Because in the end, that's the lesson the Green Cathedral gave me. Sometimes survival isn't about strength or skill or even luck. Sometimes it's about the simple courage to refuse what's calling your name. I didn't touch the Volkswagen for 2 weeks after that drive. It sat outside my apartment building like a wounded animal. Its yellow paint streaked with mud, Branches still jammed under the bumper, the windshield fractured like a spider web that wouldn't heal. Neighbors passed by and glanced at it with curiosity, but no one asked. I couldn't bring myself to climb inside. Every time I looked at it, I heard the rain again, patterned and insistent, the sound of knuckles tapping on thin metal walls. I tried to tell myself it was exhaustion, hunger, the claustrophobia of being alone in the forest for too long. I tried to fold it into something explainable, something safe. But each night, when the city quieted down, I would wake in the dark with the memory of those carved faces pressing against the inside of my skull. The way one of them had opened its eyes, the way the whispers had swelled when my hand touched that damp wood. Friends asked why I didn't join them on another weekend trip, why I canceled plans. I gave excuses. Too much work, feeling under the weather. The truth was simpler. I couldn't hear the word camping without feeling my chest tighten, without seeing that clearing again. It wasn't until the third week that I finally forced myself back into the Volkswagen. The air inside still carried the faint damp smell, moss and rain trapped in the upholstery. I sat behind the wheel, hands trembling, and just let the silence gather. Slowly, I realized something. The van wasn't the enemy. The forest had used it as a chamber, an amplifier for the voices, but the Volkswagen itself had carried me out. Its battered engine, its stubborn wheels, had refused to die when I needed it most. That old machine had been my anchor when everything else wanted me gone. That thought gave me strength, enough to start the engine again, to hear it cough and settle into its familiar low growl. The windshield crack was still there, but sunlight streamed through it like fractured glass in a church window. It reminded me of the Green Cathedral, but in a different way now. Less suffocating, more like a reminder that I had stepped into something that tried to claim me, and I had returned with my own voice intact. In the weeks since, I've replayed those hours in the woods over and over, trying to sift meaning from fear. What I've come to understand is this. The Green Cathedral isn't about belief or folklore or even the supernatural. It's about how the wild can strip you bare, peel away every excuse, every layer of denial, until only your will remains. Out there, no one comes to save you. Out there, you stand face to face with something larger than yourself, and the only weapon you have is the choice to endure or to yield. When I touched that stump, when I felt the pulse beneath the moss, part of me wanted to surrender. There's a strange temptation in it, the promise that you don't have to fight anymore, that you can let yourself be absorbed, dissolved into something eternal. But survival isn't surrender. It's the refusal to be consumed, no matter how small and fragile you feel. I think about the ranger sometimes, the way her eyes softened when she said, "The forest doesn't like that." She knew more than she admitted. Maybe everyone around the peninsula does. Maybe that's why there are so many stories about people going missing out there. Hikers whose trails vanish, campers who leave their vans behind. The forest takes what listens, and it leaves alone what resists. Now, when the rain comes in heavy sheets against my apartment windows, I don't flinch the way I used to. I listen. And if I catch that old pattern, knock, knock, pause, knock, 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 I answer it in silence with the same word I screamed inside that van. No, I'm not naive enough to think I'll never hear it again. Once you've been called, you're never entirely free. The Green Cathedral lives in memory, in smell, in sound, waiting for the cracks when you're tired or lonely. But I also know I walked out. I chose to live. And that choice is a flame no cathedral of moss and whispers can extinguish. If you ever drive north into the Olympic Peninsula, if you ever find yourself tempted to take one of those unmarked roads curling deeper into the mist, remember this. The forest doesn't need to roar to frighten you. It whispers, it invites, and it will feel like your own thoughts leading you deeper. When that happens, when the air thickens sweet and wrong, when the rain starts to knock in rhythms you almost recognize, don't follow. Don't answer. Leave while you still can. Because the Green Cathedral will always be there, patient as stone, waiting for the next traveler who mistakes silence for safety. And if you listen too closely, you'll learn what I learned out there. Not every sanctuary was built for prayer. Some are built to keep you forever, and I swear by the strength it took me to resist that I will never set foot in that place again.